The fire was visible from the beach. 40 miles off the coast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, a Standard Oil tanker called the Esso Nashville was burning on the surface of the Atlantic. It had been hit by a single torpedo at 6:47 in the morning, February 28, 1942. The explosion tore through the engine room before most of the crew had finished breakfast. 11 men died before they could reach a lifeboat. On the beach, people stood in the cold and watched, families in winter coats, a few soldiers with rifles they had no use for, a boy of maybe 10 years old standing next to his father, pointing at the column of black smoke rising against the grey morning sky. The father put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. This was not supposed to happen here. Not off the coast of North Carolina. Not 3 miles from a resort town where people came in summer to eat shrimp and play in the surf. The Atlantic Ocean was American water. Everyone knew that. Everyone had always believed that. And yet the Esso Nashville burned for 6 hours before it finally slipped beneath the surface. By that afternoon, the oil slick had reached the beach. It coated the sand black for 2 miles in either direction. The boy who had been watching with his father came back the next morning and found a dead pelican at the waterline, its feathers matted with crude oil, its eyes still open. That image appeared in newspapers across the country. The editors thought it would shock people into supporting the war effort. What it actually did was something more specific. It landed on the desk of a man named James Earl Whitmore in a small office at the Pennsylvania Railroad Yard in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He was 54 years old. He had worked for the railroad for 31 years. He had calloused hands, a bad left knee from a coupling accident in 1931, and a thermos of black coffee that he refilled twice every morning. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he folded the newspaper, finished his coffee, and went back to work. He did not know that 3 days later, his phone would ring and change everything. Whitmore had been planning to retire, not with fanfare, not with a party or a gold watch or a speech in the employee break room. He had simply begun the quiet arithmetic of an ending. Counted his pension, walked through the house on Maple Street with his wife Eleanor, and pointed at things they might finally fix. The back porch railing, the kitchen faucet that had been dripping since 1938. He had circled April in his mind like a man circling a destination on a map. He was not a man who talked much about himself. People who worked with him for 20 years sometimes realized they knew almost nothing about him beyond the railroad. They knew he could diagnose an engine fault by sound alone. They knew he had a system for every problem and patience for none of the ones people invented. They knew that when James Earl Whitmore said something would work, it worked, and when he said it wouldn't, you saved yourself a lot of trouble by listening. What most of them didn't know was that he had tried to enlist after Pearl Harbor. He had driven himself to the recruitment office in Altoona on a Monday morning in December 1941, stood in line behind young men 20 and 30 years younger than him, and handed over his papers with a steadiness that the recruiting sergeant seemed to find uncomfortable. The sergeant looked at his age, looked up at him, looked back down. "Sir," the sergeant said carefully, "the Army has specific age requirements for active service." "I'm aware," Whitmore said. "I'm offering what I have." What he had, apparently, was not what they needed. He drove home. He did not tell Eleanor. He went to work the next morning and said nothing about it to anyone. He simply continued doing what he had always done, which was keep 30-year-old machines running through sheer knowledge and stubbornness, and wait. He did not have to wait long. The call came on a Tuesday. Not from a general, not from anyone important. A mid-level War Department logistics officer named Hargrove, who spoke too fast and apologized twice for interrupting Whitmore's workday. He explained the situation in clipped, uncomfortable sentences, as though the words embarrassed him. The Army needed someone to lead a new coastal defense program. Armored trains. They had the guns. They had the rail network. What they did not have was someone who could make the equipment actually function. Specifically, they needed someone who understood old locomotives, very old locomotives. "How old?" Whitmore said. It was not quite a question. Hargrove told him. There was a pause on the line. "Those engines haven't run a revenue route since before the last war," Whitmore said. "Yes, sir, we're aware of that." "You understand, I'd be the only man in that program who's actually worked on one of them. That's precisely why we're calling you, Mr. Whitmore." He looked out the window of his office at the yard below. Snow on the ground, a crew of younger men working on a diesel switcher, their breath coming out in white clouds. "I'll need full access to the maintenance records," he said. "Everything the Army pulled from storage, and I want to see the equipment before I agree to anything." "Of course, sir." "And Hargrove." "Sir?" "Tell whoever decided not to announce this program in the newspapers that they made the right call." He hung up and sat very still for almost a minute. Then he called Eleanor and told her April was going to have to wait. What he saw at the Army depot outside Pittsburgh should have made him turn around and drive home. The locomotives were lined up in a covered maintenance bay, 8 of them, lit by hanging work lights that cast everything in a yellow that made the machines look even older than they were. They had been pulled from storage yards and secondary depots from Virginia to Ohio. Some still had the original company paint beneath the dust. One still had a brass number plate from the Baltimore and Ohio. They were, without exception, relics. The newest had been built in 1903, the oldest dated to 1891. They were small, compact tank engines designed for suburban commuter routes, stopping trains, the railroaders called them, built to pull 3 or 4 cars between stations that were barely 2 miles apart. Not freight haulers, not mainline power. The forgotten bottom shelf of American railroading, kept around because they were too modest to bother scrapping. The Army colonel assigned to oversee the procurement program was a man named Arthur Baines. He was 58 years old, had the bearing of a man who had spent his career in offices making decisions about things he had not personally touched, and seemed deeply unhappy to be standing in a cold maintenance bay looking at Victorian-era locomotives. He watched Whitmore walk the line without speaking for several minutes. "I want to be candid with you," Baines finally said. Whitmore crouched next to a running gear assembly and ran his thumb along the journal box. Dry, but the metal was sound. "Please," Whitmore said. "There are people in this department who believe this entire program is a waste of resources. Steel that could go to tanks, manpower that could go to real defensive positions." He paused. "I want you to understand the environment you're walking into." Whitmore stood up slowly, his bad knee registering its usual complaint. "Colonel," he said, "you're telling me that men who have never worked on a railroad are using the word real to describe what's useful and what isn't." Baines looked at him steadily. "These engines," Whitmore said, and he turned to look at the line of old machines behind him, "cannot run a main line. They don't have the boiler capacity, and they're too light for high-speed freight. Every serious railway man in the country would agree with that assessment." He paused. "But the coast of North Carolina is not a main line. Neither is the coast of Virginia or New Jersey or Massachusetts. The branch lines that run along those beaches were built for exactly this kind of engine. Light rail, tight curves, low clearances. You put a modern locomotive on some of those routes, and you'll derail it inside of 10 miles. He let that sit for a moment. The worst engines in the country are the only engines that can go where you need them." Baines said nothing. "Get me the maintenance records," Whitmore said. "All of them, and get me a crew." The crew came in pieces over the following 2 weeks. Young men, mostly. Mechanics who had worked for the major railroads before the war reassigned them. A few older hands who were too valuable to the Army to put in the infantry, but too experienced to waste on typing pools. They were competent, they worked hard. They were not the problem. The problem arrived on a Wednesday morning in the third week without announcement. Whitmore was at a workbench going through valve timing specifications when he heard the bay doors open. He looked up to see a man in sergeant's uniform walking toward him with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent a great deal of time in confined spaces. Medium height, dark hair going grey at the temples, a face that had seen weather. He carried a single duffel bag and a transfer order which he set on the workbench without introduction. Whitmore read it. The name was Stefan Marak. The unit of origin was listed in a way that told you almost nothing. The skills section said, in full, specialized mechanical and tactical experience, armored rail systems. You've worked on trains, Whitmore said. Yes. Combat systems, not civilian. The man looked at him with grey eyes that were entirely steady. Not civilian. Whitmore pointed at the locomotive at the far end of the bay, where two of his mechanics had spent the better part of the morning trying to synchronize the pedestal mount for the 57mm gun that would sit in the forward wagon. They had the elevation geometry wrong and kept arguing about it. Go look at that, Whitmore said. Tell me what you think. Marak crossed the floor without hurrying. He stood and watched the two mechanics for a moment. Then he stepped past them, bent over the mount, made 4 adjustments with his hands in a sequence that took less than 30 seconds, and stepped back. The mechanics tested the elevation. It moved smoothly through the full arc. They looked at each other. Marak walked back to Whitmore's workbench. Where? Whitmore said carefully. Did you learn to do that? Stefan Marak looked at him for a moment before answering. Czechoslovakia, he said. 1939. We had 4 armored trains and about 3 months of fighting before the Germans destroyed them. He said it the way a man states the weather. Flat, factual, already far away. I got out. Most of my crew did not. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He thought about what it meant. To fight an enemy on your own ground with everything you had and lose, to carry that knowledge across an ocean, to stand in a maintenance bay in Pittsburgh in 1942 and look at the same problem from the other side of it. The enemy you faced then, Whitmore said, is it the same equipment they're running now? Improved, Marak said, but the same thinking. They know how to destroy a train on a fixed route. They've practiced it. He paused. So have I. Whitmore picked up his thermos, found it empty, set it back down. Then you know exactly what we're up against, he said. Yes. Good, because I know the railroad and you know the enemy, and between the two of us we might be able to do something useful before this country runs out of tankers. He held out his hand. Welcome to the program. Marak shook it once, firmly. That night, Whitmore sat in his car in the parking lot outside the depot for a long time before driving back to his hotel. He thought about the photograph of the pelican on the black sand. He thought about the boy standing next to his father on the beach, pointing at the smoke. He thought about 12 old locomotives that no serious railroader wanted and a coastal railway network that stretched from Maine to Florida, full of tight curves and low bridges and single-track branch lines that nobody at the War Department had ever thought to use as a weapon. He thought about Stefan Marak, who had fought this enemy once with everything he had, and lost, and come back to do it again. There is a particular kind of man, not common, who is most useful to the world precisely when the world has run out of good options, who functions best when the materials are wrong, the timeline is impossible, and the people in charge have already decided it can't be done. James Earl Whitmore was 54 years old. He had a bad knee and a retirement he had postponed, and a wife waiting in Altoona who understood without needing it explained that some things matter more than April. He started the car and drove back toward the hotel through the winter dark. There was work to do. Spring came late to the Atlantic coast in 1942. It came in cold, grey sheets of rain that turned the depot yards to mud and made the work harder than it already was. It came with fog that sat on the water for days at a time, so thick that the men working the morning shift could not see the tree line from the maintenance bay doors. The fog made Whitmore uneasy in a way he did not fully explain to anyone. He had read the intelligence reports. He knew what was moving out there in the grey Atlantic water, invisible and patient. The U-boats did not care about the weather. Between January and April of 1942, German submarines sank 87 ships along the American East Coast. The numbers came across Whitmore's desk in weekly summaries that Hargrove forwarded from Washington. He read each one carefully, noted the positions, then folded the papers and put them in a drawer. He did not share them with the crew. The crew already knew. You could not work 6 days a week building coastal defense equipment and not understand what you were defending against. What Whitmore did instead was work faster. The 12 locomotives had been sorted, assessed, and assigned within the first 3 weeks. Whitmore knew each one the way a doctor knows patients. Engine 7 had a weak firebox that needed relining before it could hold working pressure for more than 4 hours. Engine 3 had worn valve guides that would cause overheating on sustained runs. Engine 11 was the best of the group. A 1897 Pennsylvania Railroad tank engine that had been maintained by a careful hand at some point in its storage years, its journals properly greased, its boiler in surprisingly sound condition. He had started calling them by number without intending to. The crew picked it up. It became the language of the program. The armor plating came from a steel fabrication plant outside Philadelphia. Half-inch plate, cut to specification, welded to the converted coal wagons that would serve as gun carriages. It was not elegant work. The welds were functional rather than beautiful, the plate fitted by men who were learning as they went. Whitmore walked the line every afternoon when the day shift ended, running his hands along the welds, checking tolerances, marking problems with chalk. Marak walked with him most evenings. He rarely offered opinions unless asked. But he was watching everything with the particular attention of a man who knows what the finished object will be used for. One evening in March, he stopped at the forward gun wagon on Train 4 and said, without preamble, "The loopholes are too high." Whitmore looked at them. "A man firing from a seated position will be aiming at the sky," Marak said. "Lower them 4 inches. Whitmore made the note. "You caught that in Czechoslovakia?" he asked. Marak was quiet for a moment. "We didn't catch it in Czechoslovakia," he said. "We found out the hard way." He moved on to the next wagon without elaborating. That was how Marak's knowledge entered the program, not in briefings or written reports. In small corrections made quietly, that saved the men who would eventually crew these trains from mistakes that had already cost other men their lives somewhere in a country most of them couldn't find on a map. Each correction was a piece of a defeat that Marak had survived and carried across an ocean. He was spending that knowledge now, here, on different ground, against the same enemy. He did not speak about it in those terms, but Whitmore watched him work and understood what he was seeing. One afternoon in late March, he asked Marak directly, "Does it feel strange doing this again?" Marak set down his wrench. He looked at the half-armored wagon in front of them for a long moment before answering. "In 1939, I believed that if we were ready, truly ready, it would be enough," he said. "We were ready. It was not enough." He picked the wrench back up. "What feels strange is not doing this again. What feels strange is believing, again, that it might matter." He went back to work without waiting for a response. Whitmore thought about that for a long time afterward, about what it cost a man to keep believing in preparation after preparation had already failed him once. About the particular kind of courage that required, not the courage of someone who had never been tested, but the courage of someone who had been tested and broken and had chosen, in full knowledge of what that felt like, to try again anyway. He made the note about the loopholes. He moved to the next wagon. By the first week of April, 6 trains were operational. By the end of the month, all 12 were ready. They were deployed along the coast from Maine to Florida, each train assigned a patrol sector and a base depot, each crew a combination of Army personnel and civilian railroad men who knew the branch lines the way Whitmore knew engine tolerances, by feel, by memory, by years of accumulated detail. Train K went to New England. Train C went to the Chesapeake region. Train G patrolled the Carolina coast, the same stretch of water where the SO Nashville had burned in February. Whitmore tracked positions on a map he had pinned to the wall of his Pittsburgh office. When the last train reported its position, he stood in front of the map for a long time. 12 trains, 12 sectors, firepower that exceeded any single piece of equipment the Army currently had positioned along that coastline, built in 11 weeks from machines that Colonel Baines had described, in a memo Whitmore had not been meant to see, as outdated equipment of questionable military value operated by personnel of advanced age. He took the memo out of his desk drawer and looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it and put it back. It was a requisition order that brought Everett Oakes into the program. Whitmore had been aware of the Cape Cod Scenic Railway for approximately 3 weeks before he made the decision. It sat in a file on his desk marked Auxiliary Assets, pending review, a thin folder containing a tourist railway map, a maintenance report, and a photograph of a small locomotive that looked, at first glance, like something from a child's amusement park. 15-inch gauge, 13 miles of track running across the flat salt marshes of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Built in the 1930s to carry summer tourists between the harbor towns. Off-season, it sat idle in a small covered shed near the coast. The operational argument for requisitioning it was straightforward. The Cape Cod Peninsula jutted 60 miles into the Atlantic like an outstretched arm. Its coastline was exposed, accessible, and had already seen 2 separate U-boat contacts within 5 miles of shore. The standard gauge branch lines on the Cape were limited. The tourist railway, however, ran directly along the most vulnerable stretch of beach, through terrain that no other vehicle, wheeled or tracked, could navigate without difficulty. The argument against requisitioning it was that it was, in every meaningful sense, a toy. Whitmore sat with the folder for 3 days. He thought about the 11 men who died on the SO Nashville before they could reach a lifeboat. He thought about the 87 ships. He thought about the boy on the beach in North Carolina. On the 4th day, he signed the requisition order. He felt the weight of it as he set down the pen. He was sending 7 men to guard the most exposed coastline in New England on a railway built for tourists. He knew what that meant. He signed it anyway, because the alternatives were worse. Everett Oakes was 22 years old and had been running the Cape Cod Scenic Railway since he was 19. He was not a soldier. He was not, by any standard military assessment, a person the Army would have chosen for anything. He was thin, moderately tall, with the particular ease of movement that comes from spending years in a small locomotive cab, and he had the habit, which Whitmore noticed immediately, of listening to engines, not listening for specific sounds, just listening, the way some people listen to music, hearing things in it that others miss entirely. He met Whitmore at the railway's small depot on a cold Tuesday morning in late April. There was still snow in the shadows of the shed. The little locomotive, number 4, named Hercules in a nod to its lack of obvious physical power, sat on the track looking both perfectly maintained and faintly absurd. Oakes showed no sign of finding any of this unusual. "You've read the requisition order," Whitmore said. "Yes, sir." "You understand what we're asking you to do. Patrol the coast. Watch for anything that shouldn't be there. Engage if engaged." Oakes paused. "Sir, if you don't mind my asking, where do you want the guns?" Whitmore looked at him. The Army had sent 4 Lewis guns, 1 designated for anti-aircraft elevation, and 2 Boys anti-tank rifles. They were sitting in wooden crates stacked against the shed wall. 6 men had been assigned to the unit, all infantry, None of them railway men. That's what we need to work out, Whitmore said. The forward wagon, Oakes said, without hesitation. The weight distribution on this track won't take a mount on the rear car without putting stress on the coupling. Forward wagon, low mount, so the gunner can brace against the front bulkhead. He glanced at the anti-aircraft, Lewis. That one on a swivel post at the center car. You'll have better arc. Whitmore studied him for a moment. You've thought about this, he said. I've been running this track for 3 years, Oakes said. I know every bump and curve between here and the harbour. If something comes in off the water, I know exactly where I'd want to be to see it first. There was a directness to him that Whitmore had not expected. No performance of confidence, no attempt to impress, just a 22-year-old man who knew his ground and was prepared to defend it. Whitmore thought briefly of what it meant to send someone this young out onto a stretch of coastline with a tourist locomotive and 6 infantry soldiers to watch for German submarines. He held that thought for exactly as long as he could afford to, which was not long. Get the guns mounted, he said. I want this train operational within 10 days. Yes, sir, Oakes said, and turned immediately toward the crates. The summer passed in a particular rhythm. The 12 trains ran their patrol routes. They saw fog and rough weather, an empty coastline, and the occasional fishing vessel that had to be radioed in and confirmed. Train G reported a possible periscope sighting off Cape Hatteras in June that turned out, after considerable excitement, to be a floating log. Train K intercepted a small boat off the Massachusetts coast in July, carrying 3 men with engine failure who were grateful for the company. No invasion came. No enemy forces appeared on the beach. Whitmore tracked all of it from Pittsburgh, driving down to inspect individual trains on a rotating schedule, spending a week at a time in the field with each crew. He watched the men settle into their routes, watched them develop the particular competence that comes not from training, but from repetition, from running the same track in every kind of weather until the track itself becomes something you carry inside you. He spent 3 days with Everett Oakes on the Cape in August. He rode the little locomotive from one end of the route to the other, watching Oakes work the controls with the same economy and attention that Marak brought to the gun mounts. They talked very little. The wind off the water was constant. The marsh grass moved in long silver waves. The ocean sat flat and bright under the summer sun, looking innocent of everything. On the second evening, sitting outside the shed watching the light go off the water, Oakes said, "Do you think they'll come?" Whitmore considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "I think they're making calculations," he said, "and the calculations may not favor them, but calculations change." He looked at the water. "You keep running your route as though they're coming tomorrow. That's the job." Oakes nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." They came on a September morning. Not the invasion. Something smaller and in its own way more immediate. A Focke-Wulf FW-200, a German maritime patrol aircraft, long range, running a reconnaissance mission along the New England coast, came in low over Cape Cod at 6:15 in the morning. It had been flying since before dawn, following the coastline, noting positions. Oakes saw it at the same moment his forward gunner did. He did not hesitate. He had thought about this moment in the abstract for 4 months. He knew the track he was on. He knew what he had. He brought the locomotive to the best position on the route, a long straight section with clear sky on both sides, and held it there. The Lewis guns opened up. What happened next is the part of the story that requires some care to tell accurately. The German pilot, seeing a train below him, began a strafing run. It was a standard attack, flown at the standard altitude calculated against the standard dimensions of a railway train. But the Cape Cod Scenic Railway was not a standard railway train. It was 15-inch gauge. The locomotive was the size of a large automobile. The entire consist, engine, 3 wagons, 7 men, was barely 40 feet long. The pilot, coming in low and fast, misjudged his altitude against a target roughly 1/3 the size he expected. He corrected, too late. The aircraft clipped the surface of the water 400 meters offshore and went straight in. The Lewis guns were still firing when it hit. Oakes brought the locomotive to a stop. 7 men stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the sudden absence of engine noise from the direction of the water. Then someone in the rear car said, very quietly, "Did we just—" "Yes," Oakes said. Another silence. "Because it was small," someone said. "The train? He didn't see it right." "Yes," Oakes said again. He thought about that for a long time afterward, about the strange geometry of it, the way the thing they had been embarrassed by, the smallness, the toy-like scale, the fact that serious military men raised their eyebrows when they heard about it, had been the precise quality that mattered when it counted most. The weakness had been the weapon. He wasn't sure what to do with that understanding, but he kept it. The official report that reached Whitmore's desk in Pittsburgh 3 days later was careful and precise in its language. Defensive unit engaged hostile aircraft. Aircraft lost control and impacted water. Unit suffered no casualties. Whitmore read it twice. He set it on his desk next to the memo from Colonel Baines about outdated equipment of questionable military value. He did not move either document for a week. In October, he drove up to the Cape to see Oakes in person. He arrived in the afternoon, found Oakes running a maintenance check on the locomotive with the same methodical attention he brought to every task, and stood watching for a few minutes before Oakes looked up. "Sir?" "Heard about September," Whitmore said. Oakes nodded. He wiped his hands on a cloth and stood up. They stood together for a moment in the autumn light, looking at the little locomotive that had brought down a German aircraft with nothing but Lewis guns and the geometry of its own improbable scale. "You did well," Whitmore said. "It was not a speech. It was not a ceremony. It was a 54-year-old man who had spent his career keeping machines running through stubbornness and knowledge, telling a 22-year-old man that he had done what needed doing." Oakes looked at him steadily. "Thank you, sir," he said. Outside, the wind moved through the marsh grass in long silver waves, and the Atlantic sat grey and cold and enormous at the edge of everything. And somewhere out in that grey water, the calculations were still being made. The trains kept running. Winter came to the Atlantic coast like a verdict. By December of 1942, the U-boat threat along the eastern seaboard had begun to change shape. The Navy had finally implemented the convoy system that British advisors had been recommending since February. Merchant ships now moved in organized groups, escorted by destroyers and patrol aircraft, their positions coordinated and their routes varied. The open-season killing that had defined the first 8 months of the year, 87 ships, tankers burning within sight of resort beaches, slowed to something more manageable. The Atlantic was not safe. It would not be safe for years. But it was no longer the one-sided arithmetic it had been in the dark early months. Whitmore read the updated assessments in his Pittsburgh office and felt something he could not quite name. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than relief. He had built 12 trains to defend against a threat that had, for the moment, receded. The trains were still running their routes, the crews were still logging their patrols, but the urgency that had driven everything, the cold certainty in his chest every morning when he read the weekly sinking reports, had shifted into something quieter. He found himself thinking, more than he expected, about what the program had actually been. In the spring of 1943, the coastal defense trains were transferred. The order came down through channels, worded in the careful bureaucratic language that the Army used when it was doing something it didn't want to explain at length. The regular Army personnel were reassigned. The trains themselves were handed over to the Civil Defense Corps, civilian units composed largely of men who worked for the railroad companies, men who knew their routes not from training but from 20 and 30 years of running them in every season and every condition. They were older men, most of them, Men who had been too valuable to their companies to release for active service, or too old for the infantry, or carrying the accumulated small injuries of decades of physical work. They wore their civil defense armbands without ceremony. They knew the trains and they knew the coast, and they took over the patrols with the same quiet competence they brought to everything else. Whitmore drove down to observe the handover at Train K's depot in Connecticut. He stood to one side and watched the new crew walk the length of the train, touching the armor plate, checking the gun mounts, asking practical questions about the locomotive's quirks. One of them, a heavy-set man of about 60, with the hands of a machinist and the deliberate manner of someone who had learned patience from years of working around moving parts, stopped at the forward wagon and studied the loophole placement for a long moment. Then he took out a small notebook and made a sketch. Whitmore recognized the motion. He had made the same motion himself in the same notebook style 1,000 times. He did not introduce himself to the man. He simply watched and thought that the program was in good hands and drove back to Pittsburgh in the long evening light. Colonel Arthur Baines came to the depot on a Tuesday afternoon in November 1943. He came alone. No aide, no driver. He parked his own car at the edge of the yard and walked across to where Whitmore was going through supply manifests at a folding table near the maintenance bay doors. The afternoon was cold and very clear, the kind of autumn light that makes everything look slightly more permanent than it is. Whitmore saw him coming and waited. Baines stopped at the table. He was not in uniform. He wore a civilian overcoat, grey, and he looked somewhat older than he had in the maintenance bay in Pittsburgh 20 months earlier. He looked like a man who had been revised by the intervening time. He stood for a moment without speaking. "Mr. Whitmore," he said finally. "Colonel." Baines looked past him at the maintenance bay, where 2 civil defense men were working on Engine 7's firebox. The same weak firebox Whitmore had flagged in the first week of the program. The same problem patiently maintained year after year. "I was wrong," Baines said, "about the program, about what it could do, about what you could do with the equipment." He paused. "I want you to know that I'm aware of that." Whitmore looked at him steadily. He had thought about this moment more than once, had imagined various versions of it. In some of them he said something precise and satisfying that settled the account cleanly. In others he said nothing which felt like its own kind of statement. What he actually felt standing in the November light with Arthur Baines in a civilian overcoat in front of him was something quieter than either of those versions, not satisfaction, not resentment. Something that had already moved past both of those things into territory that didn't have a simple name. He extended his hand. Baines shook it. "Thank you for coming," Whitmore said. "That took something." Baines nodded once, briefly. He looked at the train again. At the men working on it with the unhurried competence of people who have done a thing long enough that the doing of it has become simply who they are. "Does it work?" he asked, not rhetorically, with genuine curiosity. If it came to it, if they'd actually come. Whitmore thought about the 87 ships. He thought about Train G on the Carolina coast and the cold certainty of those weekly reports. He thought about Stefan Marak adjusting a gun mount in 30 seconds. He thought about Everett Oakes holding a tourist locomotive steady on a 15-inch track while Lewis guns fired at a German aircraft coming in low off the Atlantic. "Yes," he said, "it works." Baines was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hat back on, nodded once more, and walked back to his car. Whitmore watched him go. Then he turned back to the supply manifests and finished what he had been doing before the interruption. Later that evening, alone in the maintenance bay after the crew had gone, he sat on an equipment crate and looked at the trains for a long time. This was not something he did as a habit. He was not, by nature, a man given to reflection as an activity. Reflection, for him, happened while he was doing other things. while he was checking tolerances or reading reports or driving along the coast roads in the early morning. It happened in the margins of work, not instead of it. But he sat there anyway, in the quiet bay, with the smell of oil and metal around him and the sound of the wind off the water somewhere in the distance. He thought about what the program had been. 12 locomotives built in the 1890s, converted in 11 weeks, deployed along 1,800 miles of coastline, manned by soldiers, then by exiled veterans who brought the hard knowledge of a lost campaign, then by civilian railroaders who knew every signal box and siding on their routes, firepower that exceeded anything else the army had positioned on that coast, built for almost nothing, from almost nothing by people that almost nobody wanted. He thought about what it had not been. It had not been a battle. The trains had never engaged an invasion force on the beach. The invasion they were built to meet had never materialized. They had been ready for something that never came. He sat with that for a while. Then he stood up, turned off the work lights, and drove back to his hotel. The end came the way important things often end, not with drama, with paperwork. In September of 1944, the Pennsylvania Railroad's Maintenance Division sent a standard administrative notice to the War Department. Locomotive number 7573, currently assigned to Train K's Coastal Defense Patrol, was due for its mandatory 5-year boiler inspection. The company requested the engine's release for scheduled maintenance. It was a routine communication, the kind of letter drafted by a junior clerk and signed without much thought, because it was simply the next item in a long sequence of operational requirements. What it actually did was force a question that nobody in the War Department had formally asked in 2 years. Did the Coastal Defense Train Program still serve a military purpose? The answer, by November 1944, was self-evidently no. The U-boat threat on the eastern seaboard had been largely neutralized. Allied forces were pushing through France. The strategic picture had transformed entirely from the desperate arithmetic of early 1942. The War Department's response was brief. On November the 5th, 1944, the Railway Executive Committee was informed that all remaining armoured trains were to be withdrawn from service. The notice gave no date for a ceremony. It announced no commendations. It directed the equipment to be returned to the relevant railway companies and the armour plating to be stripped and processed. By the end of the month, it was done. Whitmore was in his Pittsburgh office when Marek came to say goodbye. He found him there the same way he had found him everywhere, at work, surrounded by papers, coffee gone cold at his elbow. Marek set his transfer papers on the desk and stood waiting. Whitmore read them. A railway yard in Philadelphia. Experienced mechanics needed. Good placement, he said. I know engines now, Marek said, almost as well as I know guns. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. Perhaps better. They stood for a moment in the quiet office. The trains were ready, Marek said then. Whatever else you can say about them, they were ready. Whitmore nodded. In 1939, mine were ready too. Marek looked out the window at the depot yard below. The difference is that yours never had to find out what being ready actually costs. He picked up his duffel bag. He shook Whitmore's hand, once, firmly, the same grip as the first time, in this same building, 2.5 years ago, when he had been a stranger with a transfer order and a skill nobody else had thought to ask about. Then he walked out. Whitmore listened to his footsteps go down the corridor and fade. He sat for a long time after that, not doing anything in particular. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall on the depot yard, soft and indifferent, covering everything equally. Spring of 1945. Whitmore finally retired. He drove home to Altoona on a Saturday morning in April, the month he had originally circled, 2.5 years late. Eleanor met him at the door. She looked at him for a moment, in the particular way she had, and said nothing about any of it. She handed him a cup of coffee and told him the back porch railing had gotten worse over the winter. He fixed it that afternoon. The kitchen faucet he fixed the following week. He did not talk about the program to his neighbors or the men he had known before the war. Not because it was classified, the classification had been lifted by then, but because there was no easy way to explain what 12 Victorian locomotives patrolling an empty coastline amounted to, and because most people, when they thought about the war, were thinking about things that had actually happened. The trains had been ready for something that didn't come. That was a difficult thing to make into a story that anyone wanted to hear. In 1956, the last locomotive from the program was retired from civilian service. It had been running commuter routes in New Jersey for 11 years after the war, carrying office workers and students and families between stations 2 miles apart, which was precisely what it had been built to do in 1897. Nobody on those trains knew where it had been. The small brass plaque mounted in the cab. During 1942 to 1944, this locomotive served as part of the United States Coastal Defense Program, was covered by years of accumulated grime and mostly unread. When the retirement was scheduled, the Pennsylvania Railroad sent a notice to a small list of former program personnel. Most of them were too far away, or too old, or too busy. Everett Oakes drove 4 hours from Cape Cod. He was 36 years old. His hair had gone grey early. A family trait, he would say if anyone asked, though anyone who had spent years running a tourist railway along the most exposed stretch of coastline on the eastern seaboard in wartime might have had their own theory. He was still thin. He still had the particular listening quality about him, the sense of a man who heard things in engines that others missed. He stood in the Pennsylvania Railroad yard in the cold morning and watched the work crew prepare to cut the locomotive apart. Before they started, he climbed into the cab. He found the brass plaque. He worked the mounting screws loose with a pocket knife, which took longer than it should have because his hands were not entirely steady. He put the plaque inside his coat. Then he climbed down, nodded to the work crew, and walked back to his car. 2 years later, in the summer of 1968, Whitmore's grandson found an old photograph in a box in the garage. The boy was 9 years old and serious about trains, in the way that 9-year-olds are serious about the things that matter most to them. The photograph showed a locomotive, small, dark, armoured with thick plate bolted along its sides, sitting on a coastal track somewhere. In the background, barely visible, was the ocean. He brought it to his grandfather and set it on the kitchen table between them. "What is that?" he asked. Whitmore looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at it the way you look at something that contains more than it shows, more history, more weight, more cost than the image itself can hold. He looked at the armoured plate and the pedestal gun mount and the flat, grey water in the background, and he thought about the 11 men on the S.O. Nashville and Stefan Marak's 4 adjustments that took 30 seconds, and Everett Oakes holding a tourist locomotive steady while Lewis guns fired, and the memo about outdated equipment of questionable military value, and the November snow falling on the depot yard the night Marak left. He thought about 12 trains ready for an invasion that never came, about the brass plaque in a box somewhere in a house on Cape Cod, about the kind of readiness that leaves no record because nothing happened, and the particular courage required to maintain it anyway. Then he looked at his grandson, who was watching him with the patient attention of a child who understands, without being told, that the answer to his question is going to be worth waiting for. "That," Whitmore said, "is a train that was ready." The boy looked at the photograph. "Ready for what?" Whitmore looked out the kitchen window at the summer afternoon, at the yard and the trees and the quiet street beyond, at the ordinary, unoccupied peace of a country that had never had to find out what it would have cost to lose it. "For whatever came," he said. James Earl Whitmore died in Altoona, Pennsylvania in the spring of 1971. He was 83 years old. The obituary in the local paper mentioned his 34 years with the Pennsylvania Railroad. It mentioned Eleanor, who had died 3 years before him. It mentioned his children and grandchildren. It did not mention the trains. Nobody who wrote the obituary knew about the trains. The information existed in archives, in War Department files that would eventually be declassified and read by historians who would note the program with interest before moving on to larger subjects. But the connection between those files and the man who had built the program, who had taken what nobody wanted and made it into the only thing that worked, that connection existed in no document anyone thought to look for. He had defended 1,800 miles of American coastline with 12 locomotives that the experts said were useless, crewed by men that the army said were too old, against an invasion that military historians would later conclude was never seriously planned. He had been ready for something that never came. And in the end, that was not a failure. It was the definition of the thing done right. The back porch railing held for 30 years after he fixed it. The kitchen faucet never dripped again. These are small things. But a man who can be trusted with the small things and with the large ones and with the ones that fall somewhere in between. A man who shows up at 54 when the recruiting sergeant turns him away and finds another door and walks through it without waiting to be thanked. That man leaves something behind that doesn't require a newspaper to record it. It lives in the work, in the trains that ran, in the coastline that held, in the 9-year-old boy sitting at a kitchen table in the summer of 1968, looking at a photograph of an armored locomotive on a coastal track, learning for the first time that being ready, truly, quietly, completely ready, is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything.